Hello and welcome to the final video in our series on John Donne. As you can see, today we're going to be discussing critical interpretations of Donne's poetry. Now, in the UK, A-level exam boards tend to refer to the use of a critical interpretation in a student's work as Assessment Objective 5, or AO5 for short. If a student discusses a critical quotation or refers to a literary theory in their work, they will gain marks for AO5. It's really important that you find out if AO5 is being assessed in your exam, and if it is, you need to find out how many marks are awarded for it. This will let you know roughly how much time you should be devoting to discussing critics in your essay. If AO5 is not assessed in a particular paper, then you'll be wasting valuable exam time if you start discussing the views of critics. So that's the crucial preliminary starter to this video. Know if AO5 is required by your exam board, and if it is, know how many marks are awarded for it. So with that out the way, let's have a look at what we're going to be discussing today. So we're going to begin the video with a discussion of some comments, opinions and quotations from particular critics. But we will leave some time at the end of the video to discuss how a feminist critic might approach Donne's work. So as I said, we'll begin with some particular critics, because quoting critics is one of the clearest ways in which you can incorporate alternative interpretations into your own work. The important thing, however, is that you discuss the quotations. You need to examine them and explain how reading the work of critics has illuminated your own view. Lower AO5 marks are awarded to students who simply quote critics, without any element of evaluation or discussion. So with that in mind, let's discuss some critical comments. Now, Donne's reputation among critics has undergone a lot of change, and I'm going to illustrate this with a very crude timeline. So, Donne died in 1631, and in the years immediately following his death, Donne was celebrated as a great poet and an insightful preacher. For much of the 19th century, however, he was ignored. He gained a reputation for being eccentric, peculiar, and almost excessively inventive, and he fell out of fashion somewhat. Donne's reputation as a great poet was only restored in the early 20th century, when writers such as ep.8 and T.S. Eliot began to take an interest in his work. It was primarily T.S. Eliot's appreciation of Donne which revived critical interest in him. Much of Eliot's comments on Donne's work celebrate the way in which his thoughts and feelings flow, develop, regress, or change over the course of a single poem. He wrote that a thought to Donne was like an experience, and I think that this comment can be evidenced by both his love poetry and his religious verses. Donne's poetry is almost always characterised by a sense of immediacy. That's a sense that it's happening right at this moment. In Batter My Heart or If Poisonous Minerals, we feel as if Donne's feelings are building and changing as he writes, as if he's writing the poem in a single sitting. In other words, Donne creates the illusion that his poetry is a sudden expulsion of feeling, rather than an intricately crafted and revised piece of writing. And I think it's that quality of Donne's poetry that Eliot is capturing here. A thought to Donne was like an experience. It's a really key quotation because I think it can be applied very aptly to almost any of Donne's poems. Of course, not every critic of Donne's work is an admirer. C.S. Lewis claims that Donne's poetry is too simple to satisfy. Its complexity is all on the surface. Now, whenever you read a critical quotation, you must always try and think of a particular poem which either supports or challenges the view being put forward. When I read Lewis's comment here, for example, I think of A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, which is a poem that we discussed in the last video. This poem is famous for its use of an elaborate, intricate conceit, that of a pair of twin compasses, but the idea underpinning the elaborate metaphor is actually very simple. Two lovers love each other so much and have souls which are so interconnected that they remain spiritually together even when they're apart physically. Now, whether you agree or disagree with the idea that this simplicity is too simple to satisfy is perhaps a personal, intuitive response to the poems, but you must justify whether you agree or disagree with Lewis here using evidence. The critic Ilona Bell focuses on Donne's relationship with convention. She argues that he often invokes traditional sources of knowledge and insight, such as the Bible, medieval philosophy, or other poets, but only to distance himself from them. He retreats from traditional ideas, images, and answers. For example, we repeatedly see Donne resisting the tropes and clichés of Petrarchan poetry. As Bell notes, he mocks the futility of the conventional Petrarchan lover, stuck in a conceit and frozen in static love for an inaccessible heavenly mistress. We saw this in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, in which Donne mocks the sigh tempests and tear floods that Petrarchan lovers subject themselves to. Bell suggests that it's this suspicion of tradition, convention, and cliché which generates Donne's unusual metaphors and images. He prefers shockingly unpoetic images that dazzle the mind and penetrate the skin, such as the flea, for example. Finally, Bell concludes with the idea that Donne is impatient with set patterns, suspicious of ready-made answers. I think that this is a really useful quotation because it applies so fittingly to both his religious and his love poetry. As we just discussed, Donne resists the ready-made answers of the Petrarchan sonneteers and his erotic verses, but he also resists conventional Christian ideas about the relationship between God and man. Take Batter My Heart, for example. Donne presents himself as the bride of the devil who must be ravished by God, and in this abnormal image he is showing himself to be impatient with the set patterns of traditional religious belief. Now, Nigel Wheel is like Ilona Bell, in that he too tries to locate trends and ideas which stretch across the whole range of Donne's poetry. You'll find that critics often like to find ideas which are shared by both Donne's religious and his erotic poems, because they're ostensibly so different. So Wheel suggests that it was the relentless search for true belief that dominated and unified Donne's life. You have the opportunity here to interrogate that vague phrase, true belief, in your essays. What does he mean by this? Is it the secret to happiness? The purpose of existence? To my mind, that phrase, true belief, means what it is that Donne should be committing himself to. Travel, learning, sex, love, God, Anne, or the church. In any of Donne's poems, though in some more than others, he's trying to unearth what it is that he should be committing himself to, wholly and utterly. Now, interestingly, Wheel also writes that Donne lived an actorish life, which I think is a really interesting phrase. It implies that there's something performative about both Donne's life and his poetry. Like an actor, he's playing a series of roles, whether that's the passionate lover or the devoted vicar, and none of these roles wholly reveal to us the real John Donne. John Stubbs lends weight to this idea. Stubbs writes that though Donne could be misogynistic, this was only one among innumerable attitudes which he adopted and explored in his writing. Those verbs, adopted and explored, imply that Donne is never completely truthful in his poetry. Once again, like an actor, he's simply pretending to be a series of characters and describing thoughts and feelings which are not really his own. The allusion to misogyny leads us nicely into the second part of this video, in which we're going to take a feminist approach to Donne's work. Feminism is a literary theory. Now, to use a very vague and basic definition, a literary theory is the application of the ideas from a different field to a literary text. Eco-criticism, Marxist criticism, and psychoanalytic criticism are all other examples of literary theories. Today, however, we're going to be focusing on feminist criticism. So, in the second video in this series, we very briefly discussed To His Mistress Going to Bed. This poem is problematic for feminist criticism for a variety of reasons, but perhaps the most obvious issue is the objectification of the female lover. She's described as a colony which the speaker is in the process of mastering and subduing. Famously, he writes, "Oh, my America, my newfound land." the notion that a woman can be possessed and subdued in this way is clearly quite problematic. In other poems, however, Donne is even more explicitly disparaging and hateful about women. In Woman's Constancy, Love's Alchemy, and Song Go and Catch a Falling Star, Donne generalises about all women and makes reproachful remarks about the nature of woman. In particular, he perpetuates the myth that women are innately fickle and capricious. Their love is presented as being fleeting and ephemeral. Other poems, meanwhile, are more subtly problematic. Last time, we discussed A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, and the way in which the woman in a relationship is described as the leg of the compass which remains still. The poem appears to celebrate the fact that Anne remains at home, the stable centre, whilst Donne roams abroad, and today we tend to view the notion of women being confined to the home as an outdated idea. Of course, you could defend John Donne against these allegations through the use of John Stubbs's argument. You could concede that yes, Donne's poetry can sometimes be misogynistic, but this is merely a role that he is playing. Like an actor, he's adopting the role of a wounded lover that has been so hurt by the woman that he loves that he cannot help but condemn all womankind. The counter-argument here, of course, would be that the poems are misogynistic whether or not Donne personally approves of that misogyny. In other words, it's still misogynistic to write a misogynistic poem, regardless of whether or not you secretly agree or disagree with your own poem. It's just one interpretation that you can consider. Stubbs also defends Donne against the accusation that his poetry objectifies women. He writes, "If this was a landscape possessed and exploited, it was also one that, as he knew very well, could confound, bewilder, and bury the explorer alive." His argument is essentially that the female figures in poems like To His Mistress Going to Bed are not powerless. Donne has the power to possess and exploit his female lovers, but his female lovers also have the power to harm him. Nevertheless, a feminist critic may well respond to Stubbs by arguing that a woman does not have to be wholly powerless to be objectified and ultimately less powerful. There is clearly an imbalance of power between Donne and his lover, and this imbalance is clearly problematic, even if the woman is not utterly powerless. So these are just a few ideas of critical arguments that you could incorporate and discuss in your work. The really important thing, indeed the whole purpose of AO5, is to show that you are aware of another side of an argument. You need to understand that ultimately there's more than one way in which Donne's poetry can be interpreted. Using words and phrases such as on the other hand, alternatively, paradoxically, and conversely in your writing will help to show an examiner that you are aware that Donne's poetry can be interpreted in multiple different ways. Of course, it's not enough at A-level to simply recognise both sides of an argument. You need to come down on a side and explain why you hold that view. Why does critic X convince you? Why is critic Y less convincing? What evidence can you draw on to support your view? So, on that crucial note, I'm going to end this series on John Donne. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any requests, please leave them in the comments.